All right, folks, we're going to read Chapter 9 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dr. Lanyon's narrative. If you recall, at the end of the last chapter, in the last chapter, Poole, Jekyll's butler, had come to Utterson's house and told him that he suspected foul play. After some build-up and some tension, we heard that the man walking in Jekyll's laboratory and writing notes asking for a chemical salt in Jekyll's handwriting had Hyde's voice and Hyde's footsteps. And so they smashed down the door. Hyde was in there, and he had committed suicide by drinking poison. They couldn't find Jekyll's body anywhere. And they found a document which was a letter from Jekyll to Utterson in Jekyll's handwriting, telling him to go read the narrative of Dr. Lanyon and then turn to his own confession and read it. There was also a will in the same strange terms as the first will, which gave Hyde everything if Jekyll died or if he disappeared for 3 calendar months. And this is in the same language, but it's to Utterson, not to Hyde. So Utterson's going to inherit everything. There's a little bit of poetic justice there. He's been a good friend all through, and he's going to inherit Utterson or Jekyll's fortune. So let's read Dr. Lanyon's narrative. I'm going to have to put on my Dr. Lanyon voice. One thing that you should note as we get into this is we have a very clear change of narrative perspective. That means that the rest of the story up until this point has been told by a limited third-person narrator, a narrator who only knew what Utterson knew, but narrated everything in the third person and in the past tense. This narrator is going to be Dr. Lanyon, and it's a letter, so he's written it in the first person. So we're changing narrative perspectives, and I think that's important. You'll also, Stevenson's really good at what he does. He's a famous writer for a reason. And one of the fun things that happens here is he changes personas. You can see the language is different. One of the chief traits of Utterson is that he's non-judgmental and not emotional. But Lanyon is very emotional and quite judgmental, and you get a lot of his emotions and judgments in this. And then we're going to see when we go to Dr. Jekyll's narrative, which is the final narrative of the story, that we shift perspectives again. We're going to still be in the first person, but it's going to be Jekyll's voice instead of Lanyon's voice. And Dr. Jekyll is overeducated. I don't know if overeducated is the word. Consummately educated, incredibly educated. And so he's going to have like this incredible vocabulary and complex sentence structure and stuff that you don't see in the other sections either. So it's kind of fun the way that Stevenson plays with narrator here. Generally speaking, your story tends to have a stable narrator from beginning to end, and there aren't a lot of changes. There are very few famous stories with major shifts in narrative perspective. I guess he's maybe leaning back to Homer and the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, we have this third-person omniscient narrator, but then, like, Odysseus starts telling everything to King Alcinous of the Phaeacians, and so we shift narrators to Odysseus, and it becomes a first-person narrator who's not entirely reliable, which is kind of fun. But we have a similar thing in the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, which we all read in class. And you have shifts of narrator. You know, every time a new person steps up to tell a story, you're getting the story filtered through their perspective. So I want you to put on that sort of hat and think about this in the same way you might think about the Canterbury Tales, and how we have different narrators that have different goals and ideologies and thought processes, and that I think comes across clearly in here. All right, I'm going to shut up, put on my Dr. Lanyon voice, and read this to you. Chapter 9, Dr. Lanyon's narrative. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope. That means he had to sign for the envelope. Didn't just come in the mail. It came delivered, and he had to sign for it. Addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him indeed the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify the formality of registration. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. So he gets this registered letter that he has to sign for. It's from Jekyll, and it's the day after the party. So if we go back, hold on, if we go back chronologically and place where this letter occurs, it's going to be in the middle of chapter 6, the incident of Dr. Lanyon. Hyde killed Carew, right? And then Jekyll looked sick and said Hyde had gone away forever and forged that note. Then Jekyll was better for 2 months and sort of got religion and was super charitable and threw a party for Utterson and Lanyon. The day after that party is when this letter takes place. So we're inserting information here. So this is before Lanyon dies. It is before Utterson and Enfield see anything at Jekyll's window, and it's certainly before Chapter 8, the last night, when all of that other events, or all those other events took place. You got to rewind in your mind. You got to insert this information into the narrative where it belongs. All right, where was I? This is Dr. Jekyll's letter. It ran 10th December, 1886. And dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when, if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason depend on you, I would not have sacrificed my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honor, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose after this preface that I am going to ask you for something dishonorable to grant. Judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Aye, even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor, to take a cab unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has his orders. You will find him waiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced open. You are to go in alone, and to open the glazed press letter E on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out, with all of its contents as they stand, the fourth drawer from the top, or, which is the same thing, the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you, but even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents, some powders, a vial, and a paper book. This drawer I beg you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square exactly as it stands. All right, so this is the favor he wants Utterson to, or Lanyon to do. He says, you know, get in your carriage, go to my house, break open the door of my study, and bring a drawer from one of my shelves to your house. So far, so good. That is the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once upon the receipt of this, long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour, in a strange place, laboring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that, if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, Henry Jekyll. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office might fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon reading this letter, I made sure my colleague was insane. It looks like I gotta move this over just a little bit. So Lanyon's like, he's crazy, right? Like, because that letter does sound a little insane. He's gonna meet somebody at midnight in his house, and he'll get an explanation if he wants it. I mean, okay. But till that was proved beyond the possibility of a doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from the table, got into a hansom. A hansom is a carriage or cab, usually not very big, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival, and he had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, and had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came in while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theatre, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. The door was very strong, and the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed he would have great trouble and have to do much damage if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this last was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out a drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied in a sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to be a simple crystalline salt of a white color. Ah, we've seen that salt before, or at least heard about it in the last chapter, chapter 8. The vial, to which I next turned my attention, might have been about half full of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book, and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here and there a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, double, occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of several hundred entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation, total failure. All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. Here were a vial of some salt, the record of a series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. Ah, so one of the reasons that Lanyon is a doctor and not a chemist is because he's practical. Being a doctor, you're healing people. You're making a meaningful difference in the world, and he seems to think that as a chemist, Jekyll is just playing with science rather than doing something meaningful. That's interesting, and I think there's a note of judgment there. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honor, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could just go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease, and though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defense. Aha, things are getting intense. Lanyon is waiting for this person that Jekyll has sent to him, and he's got a revolver in his pocket, loaded and ready to fire if he needs to. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London ere the knocker sounded very gently on the door. I went myself at the summons, and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. "Are you from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked. He told me, "Yes," by a constrained gesture, and when I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me without a searching backward glance into the darkness of the square. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's-eye open. That's a lantern. It was called a bull's-eye lantern. It's before flashlights. It's essentially what a police officer would use before the invention of flashlights. And at the sight, I thought my visitor started and made greater haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room. I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here at last I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I have said. I was struck besides with the shocking expression of his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution, and last but not least, with the odd subjective disturbance caused by his neighborhood. This bore some resemblance to incipient rigor, and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste, and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms, but I have since had reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of man, and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principle of hatred. So, You could really see Lanyon's narrative style here. He does sort of when he describes Hyde, which is very different from how Utterson sort of described him, he's looking at him in a very medical way. He's noticing the way that he feels and the way his body responds to seeing Hyde. And it's clearly, he's responding to this idea of deformity or something wrong with him or the hatred that everybody else feels, but he puts it in very medical terms. But I also think it's really interesting that we get this line here at the end. I have since had reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of man. This is our first hint at those themes that we talked about at the beginning of the story. The nature of humanity. Are we good or are we evil? These sorts of things. And we'll have to talk about that as time goes on. But Stevenson has finally gotten far enough into his novel that the crime and detection part is starting to be wrapped up, and he's starting to be able to talk about the themes that he seeded earlier in the story, and that once you've read it once, I highly recommend you go back and read it a second time and start to pull out and see the connections that go in between all of these things, because they're here and they're strong. Anyway, this person, who had thus, for the first moment of his entrance, struck in me what I can only describe as a disgustful curiosity, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of a rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him. In every measurement, the trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of his coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from moving me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, and revolting. This fresh disparity seemed but to fit in with and reinforce it, so that to my interest in the man's nature and character there was added a curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and the status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with somber excitement. "Have you got it?" he cried. "Have you got it?" And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. "Come, sir," said I, "you forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example, and sat down myself in my customary seat, with as fair an imitation of my ordinary manner to a patient as the lateness of the hour, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror I had of my visitor would suffer me to muster. "Beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon," he replied civilly enough. "What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to more politeness. I come here at the insistence of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understood—" He paused and put his hand to his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against— oh, sorry, I missed my voice. He paused and put his hand to his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against the approaches of the hysteria. I understood a draw. But here I took pity on my visitor, suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," said I, pointing to the drawer, where it lay on the floor behind a table, still covered with a sheet. He sprang to it, and then paused, and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws, and his face was so ghastly to see that I grew alarmed both for his life and reason. "Compose yourself," said I. He turned a dreadful smile on me, and, as if with the decision of despair, plucked away the sheet. At the sight of the contents he uttered one loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified, and the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control, "Have you a graduated glass?" That would be a graduated cylinder. Anybody who's been in chemistry class knows what those look like. A big long tube with like the measurements along the side. I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mixture, which at first was of a reddish hue, began, in proportion as the crystals melted, to brighten in color, to effervesce audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapor. Suddenly, at the same moment, the Ebullition? I'm going to have to look that word up. I don't even know how to say it. Hold on one second. Apparently it's ebullition, the action of bubbling or boiling. I know I interrupted an important part, but I always wanted to know. I don't know if you guys can hear it when I push play, but...
Ebullition.
There it is.
Ebullition.
All right, back to the beginning of the sentence. The mixture, which at first was of a reddish hue, began in proportion as the crystals melted to brighten in color, to effervesce audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapor. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. "And now," said he, "to settle what remains. Will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and to go forth from your house without further parley? Or has the greed of curiosity too much command of you? Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul. Or, if you shall so prefer to choose, a new province of knowledge and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you here in this room, upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan." Whoa! Well, first off, Hyde is a lot smarter than we thought he was. He seemed to be sort of a dumb person earlier, but now, like, look at this language, and this is so intense. So, this is a Matrix moment. Take the blue pill, take the red pill, and it goes directly back to the Garden of Eden scene in the Bible. There's, I think, an allusion here. It's a question of knowledge. Should Dr. Lanyon wish it, he can stay and gain knowledge of what's going on. Should he not wish it, he can leave and remain ignorant, and ignorance is bliss. So look at what he says. As you decide, it shall be left. You shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser, unless a sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul. Or, if you shall so prefer to choose, if he chooses to stay, a new province of knowledge and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you here in this room upon the instant, and you shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan. If Satan were to see this thing, he would believe in God, right? Like, I don't know if Satan has unbelief. I don't know if that's but whatever the case, he's clearly invoking Satan here too, I think, which is important. But yeah, "Sir," said I, affecting a coolness that I was far from truly possessing, "you speak enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no very strong impression of belief. But I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before I see an end." So Lanyon elects to stay and see what is going to happen. "It is well," replied my visitor. "Lanyon, you remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession." That's interesting. So Hyde here is invoking doctor-patient confidentiality, which was a thing going way, way back. But it's interesting, he says, "our profession," implying that both he, Hyde, and Lanyon are doctors, that there's something going on. There's a kinship there. "And now, you who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, you who have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine, you who have derided your superiors, behold." He put the glass to his lips and drank it one gulp. The cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes. Apparently his eyes are like if you took like a syringe and injected extra fluid into the eyeballs, are like all bulgy out. That's a gross image, but so powerful. Injected eyes, gasping. Sorry, I'm mixing my accents. He put the glass to his lips and drank it one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with an open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter. And the next moment I had sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall, my arms raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. "Oh, God!" I screamed, and "Oh, God!" again and again, for there, before my eyes, pale and shaken and half-fainting and groping before him with his hands, like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. What he told me in the next hour I cannot bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw. I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it. And yet, now, when that sight has faded from my eyes, I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me, the deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night, and I feel that my days are numbered, and that I must die, and yet I shall die incredulous. As for the moral turpitude that the man unveiled to me, even with tears of penitence, I cannot now, even in memory, dwell on it without a start of horror. I will say but one thing, Utterson, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew. Hasty Lanyon. So that is Dr. Lanyon's letter. And of course, thunderbolt, like it rends the whole thing open and tells you that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. And we don't really know any of the particulars, though. We don't know how Hyde came to be. We don't know what was going on with Lanyon that he needed to go to, with Jekyll, that he needed to go to Lanyon's house. What's going on with the chemical salt? We got a lot of question marks still, and they're going to be answered in the next chapter, which is Dr. Jekyll's confession. But certainly we get a lot of answers here in this one, and it's a pretty well organized and well developed chapter. All right, I'm going to stop here, and we'll go on to the next one in just a little bit.